I'll just start by talking a little bit about the Regenerative Ag Idea Network, or Regain, which is the network that's hosting the call today. And if you're new to Regain, no worries, it's also new. It launched earlier this year and is a community of practice that's designed for regenerative ag educators, advocates, and practitioners. And Regain's online platform, and I'll put the link in the chat, provides a space to discuss challenges, share successes, access peer expertise, with the ultimate goal of increasing opportunities for collaboration and connectivity within regenerative ag. And one of the things that we're doing is trying to host informal calls like this, bring people together to talk about issues that connect us all. These office hours happen a couple times a month, and we've had a few great sessions so far. All the recordings are on the website if you want to get caught up. And we've also got some great sessions coming up in May. Jared Lumen of the Sustainable Farming Association in Minnesota will be speaking, and then also Dr. Randy Jackson, who's also involved with Grassland 2.0 and is a professor at Grassland Ecology at UW-Madison. So we'd love to see you back in May. And with that, I think we can get to the topic of today. And Marshall is going to talk about his work, share some slides, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So if you want to put questions in the chat as he's going through, feel free, and we'll get to those in the discussion. So Marshall, take it away.
Thank you, Jane. I appreciate it, and really appreciate being with you all today to talk about a series of topics that are sort of all balled up into one that are a great passion of mine: grasslands, birds, and ranching, and how they all work together. Uh, as a environmentalist, it's I think still a sort of odd when I say ranching and cattle, and I hope today for those that might be newer to this sort of concept, to shed some light on the pinnacle question that I'm always asked when I meet new people is, what is Audubon doing certifying, working with cattle ranching? Isn't Aren't cattle and cattle ranching bad for the environment? And that's certainly, we use terms like regenerative, holistic, sustainable. It's interesting. We began this effort, the Conservation Ranching Initiative, sort of prior to regenerative as a word being so widely used in the American food and agriculture vernacular. So that's kind of interesting, and we've always had I'd say less a hard and fast definition of regenerative, but I always like to use regenerative and bird friendly in the same sentence, in the same context. Um, it's hard to have one. I would say it's impossible to have one without the other. And I'll walk through why that is, and how we, as the National Audubon Society, came to this specific work through this sort of discrete certification program. And I'll try to touch on some broader topics as well. Obviously, our foray into this work is precipitated by, or the impetus for, is certainly the loss of grassland birds. Grassland birds, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in depth here, are the most imperiled suite of bird species, period. A number of you named some grassland birds like the bittern and the eastern meadowlark. If I were to say what my second favorite bird would be, it would be the western meadowlark, the more gregarious and chatty of the two. And I think some other grassland obligate birds were named as well. And that's sort of been a driver for Audubon uh, doing this work. So a little background on kind of, this picture right here is always interesting to me. It's for years, when I started working with Audubon, which was straight out of college, I studied business at the University of Minnesota, and I sort of came back to grasslands through a sort of circuitous a way or path. I grew up in the city, So Dallas, Texas, and Los Angeles, California. Hard concrete, asphalt, brick and mortar as far as the eye can see. As a young black man growing up in this environment, the environment was just not something that I much thought about. I didn't have some spark as a kid that led me to conservation or to grasslands. But I always remember we traveled a lot between Dallas and Los Angeles, and most of that time, if you travel between Dallas and Los Angeles or Texas and California, most of the time you spend in West Texas. It seems like it goes on forever and ever. And the only thing in West Texas, for to keep you entertained were cattle ranches, grassland birds, and open fields. And I didn't know how much of a mark or stamp that left on me years ago. And it was actually in a prairie chicken blind that I had come to in a roundabout way one morning while studying business, that I remembered how at peace, how uh, uh, comfortable I felt in that environment. And I've never liked, I'm never going to be someone that lives in a big city. I live in Fargo, North Dakota, and Fargo's getting too big for me. So I kind of like more of the slower, I guess you could say, slower pace life. And Audubon has afforded me the opportunity to live and grow professionally here in Fargo, North Dakota. And so, a little bit of background on, again, some of the why. And there's no more pressing why than the 3 billion birds report that many of you are likely familiar with out of Cornell, which indicated that we've lost 3 billion birds since 1970. And to put that in context, uh, and I won't go down on this diatribe against Earth Day, but you think about Earth Day, right, as the pinnacle of environmental awareness and engagement and advocacy. Since 1970, since the first Earth Day, we've lost 3 billion birds. And the majority of those birds have been grassland birds. And we've lost more than 53% of our grassland birds just since 1970. And when you add in that most shorebirds, like the long-billed curlew, the marbled godwit, the piping plover, actually nest within the grassland ecosystem within alkali flats and alkali lakes, and shallow wetlands, you get a bigger picture of the catastrophe that's sort of unfolding out on the prairies. In my backyard, this is a view of the prairie pothole region, which is in many ways the biodiversity Serengeti of of North America. It is ripe with these glaciated depressions or wetlands, these across this whole landscape, surrounded once by grassland habitat. And so when I push this and show you this change over the last 100 years, what you're seeing is roughly a 70 to 80% loss in the wetlands and grasslands within the prairie pothole region. And that same story has played out all across the central grasslands, which were once grasslands, shrublands, and sagebrush were once our most ubiquitous native ecosystem in North America. And while we've lost probably 50% or more of this landscape, within certain ecoregions, I know a number of you are from the Northern Great Plains and the upper Midwest, we've actually lost 99% plus of that ecoregion, such as the northern tallgrass prairie of Wisconsin and Illinois, Indiana, Michigan. About 99+% of that is gone, converted mostly to urbanization and more prominently to row crop agriculture. I always I get in a little bit of a fit when I sort of hear that uh, uh, ridding ourselves of cattle and red meat and going more to a plant-based diet will solve our a big portion of our environmental issues. That's for someone who wakes up in the morning and does this work every day. I know that that is a at best a incomplete story, because of the symbiotic relationship between large herbivores and the grassland ecosystem. And uh, when you add up the sum total of the conservation efforts over the last 100 years in this ecosystem, we've protected, drum roll, a sum total of 5.5% of the entire ecosystem. So to say that our traditional means of grassland conservation, be it easements, acquisitions, et cetera, we're coming up way short would be a gross understatement. And this was sort of the backdrop of Audubon taking a look at what's happening and thinking about new tools to combat both the stigma surrounding and the awareness gap surrounding the potential and the role of cattle and bison on the landscape, and also directly influencing positive outcomes on the ground for grassland birds. And I think of grassland birds, and if you would, for at least the next 30 minutes or so, think about grassland birds and as a really great indicator of overall ecosystem health. Grasslands, I think of grasslands as sort of uh, the troubadours and songstresses of my time in nature, sort of my playlist when I'm out in nature. And it could be a grassland trail walk or just getting out of my truck and walking to my house. I hear the robins and the cardinals. It's sort of how I think about it as the playlist out in nature. And there's a saying, where birds thrive, people prosper. And I think that's a good example of the role that grassland birds play in telling us about our environment, the access to clean water, clean air, habitat, vibrant insect populations, et cetera, et cetera. And so birds are the prism through which Audubon views our work. And I think birds are an incredible sort of ambassador for the overall environments. We have the saying, birds tell us, and you can fill in the blank on what birds indicate or tell us, and what songbirds are telling us. Uh, uh, what songbirds once told us through their dynamic songs, they're telling us now through their silence. And there are vast landscapes throughout the continental US where the songs of the meadowlarks and the bobolinks have fallen completely silent for hundreds of miles. I talked to breeding bird survey volunteers that I have a friend, Dave Lambeth. He lives in Grand Forks, North Dakota. He's been a professor. He's actually been retired for 20 years. But prior to that, he was a professor for roughly 40 years at the University of North Dakota. And for about that entire period, he's done the breeding bird surveys, and he's seen entire landscapes, hundreds of miles in diameter, fall silent in terms of hearing Western meadowlarks. And 40 years ago, he would have heard 150 Western meadowlarks on any given one of these breeding bird survey routes. So this notion of, and we think about the grassland ecosystem. I like to think of the grassland ecosystem a lot like I think about the Amazon rainforest. In the scale of loss and conversion that we see in this ecosystem, often in many years, parallels or exceeds the pace of loss within the rainforest. This is our rainforest. It's subtle, maybe not as stark as seeing a 100-foot tree knocked over, but this is sort of our rainforest. It sort of speaks to our soul, and that is really important. They say anyone can love a mountain, but it takes soul to love the prairie. It is a subtle ecosystem, a subtle landscape, but what's happening on this landscape is anything but subtle. And this is a picture of a grassland field over the course of about 3.5 months. Um, in the spring, it was a vibrant grassland providing all manner of ecosystem services, including carbon sequestration, grassland bird habitat, pollinator habitat. There's a series of wetlands over here. And so as rain water and snow melt would happen, these grasslands would sequester that water out of the off the landscape and slowly purify and discharge that water. You can see down here a few weeks later, turned over, um, that grassland soil broken up, those roots broken up for the first time, and this thousands of years of linkages broken sort of in an afternoon with a couple passes by a tractor. And now no longer will that landscape provide bird habitat. And I want to be very clear. We have evolved to a place where we have to have farmland. And the better that farmland can be managed is obviously better for all of us. No-till practices, reducing chemicals, managing chemicals, using nature as a tool and a partner in growing our food. There's no doubt we need farmland, but we have reached a tipping point where more and more farmland that we need, we're going to lose more and more native prairie, and that ecosystem is already very much in peril. So I tend to say this as much as I can because I think it sums up and it has at times put people on their heels. You know, if we don't have cows, we won't have grass, and we won't have birds. And birds are a euphemism for pollinators, bees, butterflies. Uh, Whenever native sod is broken and converted, we lose about 50% of the carbon that is stored within those soils. Some estimates are a little bit higher, some a little bit lower, but about 50% of the carbon stored is lost. And so birds are an incredible, and of course the birds disappear. And so birds are this incredible indicator of what's happening on the ground in these ecosystems. And so we've been making this connection, and the most important part of this connection is habitat loss and the fate of our environment is inextricably linked to our food system and our food choices. Surprise, surprise, right? Food and energy, the choices that we make. We have for too long set up sort of false dichotomies between habitat and the environment and our food system. There's sort of a mental firewall, I think, for too many people in separating those things. And we, I suppose, came to the realization that we had to build a conservation program that made a difference for birds on the ground, but embedded, more importantly, embedded conservation, grassland conservation into the food system. And and again, it's not just about the birds. When you think about pollinators and what they would sort of say to us in this moment, it's pretty clear, right? And so this is what we wanted to create, a integrated value chain, including these stakeholders. Obviously, this needs to be beneficial for our landowners, must be beneficial for pollinators and those ecosystem services. Has to be a product that people enjoy and is better for them. And of course, at the center of it for Audubon is that the grassland bird habitat. It's interesting. How many folks, by show of hands, have read Aldo Leopold's Sands County Almanac? Good deal. It's sort of a must read, right? For those of us working are interested in conservation and the sort of land ethic that Aldo Leopold would articulate through those writings. But years before he wrote the Sands County Almanac, or the Sands County Almanac was published, he wrote in the Audubon magazine in 1942, and he articulated what we have come to know or understand as market-based conservation. This notion of embedding conservation values at the core of a food supply and rewarding the folks that do that, rewarding the stewards that are kind of at the tip of the spear in making the changes that align their production with the production of grassland birds and the health of that ecosystem. And so the Conservation Ranching Initiative was born from this impetus as a potential scalable tool or solution to this overarching problem. That's not to say that we seek to enroll every bit of acres that are left of grassland habitat into the program. It's not. Uh, that's just to say that uh, this was a part of the environmental community, the grassland conservation community. This was an element that was missing when we began this work in 2012. We began the research and development of a certification that was based primarily on biodiversity. We have organic certifications, we have different types of certifications, but really no certification at that time that was speaking primarily or exclusively to biodiversity and birds. And given that there are 48 million birders in the country, we felt that this was a missing component in the food sector. And I want to be clear, organic does not in and of itself mean bird friendly. I've been, unfortunately, on quite a few organic farms and ranches that were, in terms of local wildlife and native birds and pollinators, were managed worse than some conventional ranches that I have been on. And so managing for birds, managing for local wildlife is its own sort of discipline. And we felt that this certification could incentivize, guide, and encourage the adoption of regenerative bird-friendly grazing practices in cattle production. We've scaled the program to over 3.5 million acres, just short of 4 million acres today. It includes more than 150 family cattle and bison ranches. And by this summer, the products will be available in more than 1,400 points of purchase. That includes 300 Whole Foods, 250 Meijer grocery stores in the upper Midwest, and we're sort of expanding beyond that. We see that we anticipate by early next year, we will have enrolled more than 35% of the entire domestic grass-fed beef market into under this bird-friendly certification. And we've tried to create a certification that sort of had, I hate to say teeth, because that would sort of juxtapose us to our ranchers that are enrolled in the program. So I wouldn't say that, but uh, a common theme from our producers has been encouraging us to create something that was accountable, had integrity, because that is what would help them in the marketplace. And so that is what sought to do. All of our practices are the practices of the ranches are audited by Food Alliance, so a third party verifier. We do not charge farmers and ranchers for this certification. We believe strongly in maintaining a firewall between the science and the financial flow associated with this program. We've stood this program up and we deliver the program, including all of the ecological monitoring, the audits, the soil carbon monitoring, the technical assistance, the cost share. We deliver all of that, and we've stood this program up through philanthropic means. So we do not cost share or revenue share with our ranchers, and we do not cost share or revenue share with our market partners. And that includes just recently our partnership with Panorama Meats, which is the largest organic grass-fed beef brand in the country. So we finance this program uh, exclusively through philanthropy, and most certifications can't say that, and we're proud to be able to say that. Now, one day, Harvard Business School is going to do a case study on what not to do, and they're going to feature me. But we feel strongly and continue to maintain that firewall. Our bird friendly, the sort of meat and potatoes of our program are contained in our bird friendly production standards. And those are broken down into four sections. The habitat management, each ranch develops in partnership with a Audubon certified range ecologist, habitat management plans. And those include habitat management, forage and feeding. So this is a grass-fed, pasture-raised program. Confined feeding is strictly prohibited. The use of neonicotinoids within both the grazing and non-grazing portions of the farmer ranch are prohibited. Environmental sustainability, you think of that as maybe a creek that runs through a ranch, and the cattle have had access to that creek, and there's soil erosion, maybe water quality issues. It's not something that we spot and we write something in red writing, red ink. It's usually something that the landowner's been wanting to do, modify their grazing to limit the access to that creek uh, by their cattle. And so we identify these different projects that we help fund and cost share to make that ranch more bird friendly and sustainable. And also, we made a decision early on that we wanted to stand this certification up for wildlife, but also for the livestock, and ensure that there was a standard of animal husbandry and welfare that was practiced on any ranch that carried the Audubon Green Seal. We feel strongly about that, and our ranchers feel strongly about that, and they're eager to be held accountable to that. And many of them were already very conscious about the Temple Grandin methodologies and the different practices that are out there. And we've modeled a lot of our animal welfare standards off of Temple Grandin and other leading husbandry advocates. And so when I think about regenerative bird-friendly grazing, and you've probably seen some sort of graph like this elsewhere, but really what we're after here is creating that sort of structural heterogeneity out of the landscape. Upland sandpipers need something completely different for much of their breeding life cycle than, say, a western meadowlark. If you visit some early season hay fields that have just been cut, It's likely that's where you're going to find your upland meadowlark. So one size does not fit all, and we wouldn't want one size or one type of grazing, or one uniform grazing methodology. Creating that sort of patchwork of habitat heights and habitat composition is really beneficial to wildlife, and it more mimics what you would have found on the landscape prior to the introduction of cattle. And so grass that in some cases 40,000 bison may have grazed over it and taken it down to nothing. Maybe fire would have spread through it and stimulated those soils and stimulated that forb and wildflower component. So creating that sort of patchiness this is the bedrock of our habitat management plans that we developed with the landowner. And this is really aiming to create that healthy habitat for birds, encourage better soil management and soil health that sequesters more carbon out of the atmosphere. Um, and that's a really, I think, growing concern, our thought within our national consciousness, the soil carbon and carbon in the atmosphere. And quite frankly, it was a big consideration of ours in creating this program and placing the Audubon name on beef and bison products, and uh, really doing a deep dive of the literature, the research, really, uh, assuaged our concerns that this program and the lands enrolled in this program can actually be a natural climate solution if we're doing our job and we're facilitating management that creates and promotes and executes better soil health and soil management. And again, the bottom line is we have to make this profitable for our landowners. And if we don't, if bird lovers don't buy into this and pay maybe and sometimes maybe a little bit of a premium, then landowners are discouraged from making the changes that this program and this methodology requires. And so certainly this may cost a little bit more, but we believe it's doing a whole lot more, and that's been proven out through the science that we've developed, and I'm going to touch on that as well. Again, these birds, many grassland birds, are what we call neotropical migrants. So they spend their breeding months in the continental US and maybe up into Canada, and they overwinter in Mexico or Central America. Uh, and we have ranches from the Chihuahuan Desert of Texas out to the Central Valley and on in through the Northern Great Plains. And each one of those ranches are managing a little bit different for a little bit different life cycle for grassland birds. And when you look at the life cycle of long-billed curlews, you kind of see all of these different places that you need to work and work differently to manage for long-billed curlews. And I could say that about so many other grassland birds as well. So what have we seen so far? On average, of the ranches that are enrolled in Audubon's program have increased their bird abundance by 36%. So we conduct bird monitoring on each ranch every year, and then after, I believe, 3 years, it's every other year. This is sort of, we have to have this data to prove out the bird friendliness of our program. And so we monitor both the birds on individual ranches. We have tools to compare the bird abundance and diversity and resilience to nearby landscapes and nearby ranches that aren't enrolled in our program. And then obviously monitoring the success of birds over time on our ranches. And all of these data points are pointing in the right direction and bolstering our confidence behind the Audubon Green Seal. And then efficiency. We delivered this program at just above $1 an acre. So this is a little bit outdated, probably about $1.20 an acre. But when you compare that to other mainstream grassland conservation programs such as CRP, and you want to scale, let's say, an additional 3 million acres on the landscape, you can get a sense of if you can make the market work, then the program can be infinitely more cost effective and have an infinite ability to scale over time. And I could list, CRP is about average $128 an acre in the prairie pothole region. Um, Acquisitions, easement acquisitions are between $800 and $1,200 an acre. And acquisitions can be as high as $5,000 an acre in this part of the world. So uh, having a program that is cost effective is obviously given us a ability to scale. And you can kind of see enrollment from a ranch perspective, completing the HMPs, having the ranch audited by our third party auditor. And we continue to do the bird and habitat monitoring, which will now include the soil carbon and soil health and water filtration and quality monitoring as well. So we've wrapped that data up to serve two express means, our outcomes. Number one, feeding that data back into the habitat management plan to tweak or change or prove out what our ranchers are doing. So we avail that data to them to empower their management, and also to help tell the story of what we mean by bird-friendly beef, what we mean by regenerative bird-friendly grazing, because it is not sort of a contradiction to that mainstream thinking about or against cattle as a management tool, cattle as an impact on the environment. It's actually when you place the environment into its more appropriate, broader context. The environment includes biodiversity, it includes ecosystem services, and yes, it includes carbon in the atmosphere. And so we always are trying to encourage that more comprehensive story. Too often lately, I think that we are getting fixated on climate and carbon. Climate, and we have to be clear, we have to ensure a climate secure future. But if we do it the wrong way, we will sort of be in a position of cutting off our nose to spite our face. And I think of it along the lines of the war on fat. Remember that? Every expert would say, fat is the enemy, eliminate fat, low fat. And what happened? Our carbs, our sugar went up, and we've become so unhealthy. And it's because of our food system. And it's because we've become fixated on certain aspects and lost grasp of the bigger picture. I think that has a chance of happening as we work to address climate change. We can lose sight of the bigger picture. And that's why through this program and our other work, we're encouraging more thoughtful approach to food production and the food system. I sort of personally despise meatless Mondays. I think it's a time to actually encourage mindful Mondays. Maybe throughout the course of your week, you don't think about where your meat or your food comes from. Maybe Monday is a time to seek out that maybe you for whatever reason don't purchase beef from a organic or Audubon certified local ranch. Maybe Monday is when you do. Monday is when you visit that restaurant that sources from Audubon certified ranches. So um, I'm always encouraging this bigger picture thinking about the environment and grasslands and cattle and agriculture. So our goals over the next couple of years, obviously, is to increase the size of the program, the impact of the program, knowing that on average we have the potential to increase bird abundance by 36% is incredibly encouraging to us. And that paper has been published and peer reviewed. I certainly could drop it in the chat box for you to dig into the data, but we're buoyed by, we always wanted to base this program on good science, and we've been buoyed by the early returns, so to speak, from our ranches, both at an individual level and then aggregated as well. So with that, I want to turn it over to you all. I'm sure you have questions. I may have gone a little bit over here than I intended, but I really appreciate you listening and learning more about sort of the bird's eye view, or the bird's perspective on regenerative agriculture and what it means.
Thanks so much, Marshall. That was great. I've got a question. I know there's increasing conversation about ecosystem service payments to support transition to regenerative practices, and I'm wondering what you think about that versus more of the market premium side, which is where you all land.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I remain committed to the product being the most important messenger and source of value for these practices. So the beef, right? The bison, the products, whether it's boots made from regenerative, bird-friendly, certified land, and we have a number of products that are in a number of producers that are sourcing to timberland and to other groups that for their supply chain. I still believe that should be the focus, but we have designed our soil carbon monitoring in a way that could help facilitate all or various groups of our ranches tapping into those offset markets. So we are encouraging that, and we are making a $1.5 million investment to empower all of our ranches with that baseline monitoring done through a methodology that is accepted by many soil carbon offset markets to explore that at their discretion, and we're going to encourage it. And I think it's a really intriguing supplemental income stream to support great grassland habitat management. I do worry about the long game. And you have these contracts that might be 30 or 60 or 100 years. You know, if we are successful, we will have greatly reduced our carbon. We would have greatly made progress towards a decarbonized marketplace and economy. My worry is, who continues to pay the landowner 20 years from now? Who continues to keep up with the costly monitoring of these projects over time? I have a latent worry that the landowner can possibly be sort of stuck with the bill when it's all said and done. But I think it's an absolute, it's a positive thing, certainly a positive step. And we are encouraging and through our investments, empowering our ranches to seek those opportunities.
Super interesting. Thanks.
Marshall, can you mentioned that you're using methodology that's recognized by a number of the offset markets. Can you say which one?
Yes, it's the Vera carbon standard. VMR 0021.
Okay.
I have a question for you, Marshall. Really appreciate that. I'm curious, I know you're working, you mentioned the just percentage of grassland that's in private ownership and working with different ranches and whatnot. And apologies if I missed, if you spoke to engagement that you've taken around and working with, ranching as it extends into public land leases, especially at BLM and whatnot, and just looking at what's coming in the next 4 years and what seems to be increased emphasis on kind of renewed or expanded conservation practices. Do you see kind of a next step there to build stronger relationships that extend into those public land leases, especially further west?
Yeah, that's a great question, Pete. And the overarching answer is yes. We're public lands opportunities are dominating my schedule these days because we already have quite a number of our ranches that their grazing operations overlap onto and with public land. And we hope that this program can help those producers not only be better managers, but also communicate that the results of their improved management when applying for lease renewals, allotment renewals, et cetera, et cetera. We also understand that this is a hot button topic, particularly in the Intermountain West and West, and we want to be mindful of that. When I look at the historic bison range, most of that area is conducive to cattle grazing and cattle management when done properly and at stocking rates and et cetera, that are appropriate for the landscape. And so we certainly encourage that. And we are working at the interface on a number of fronts with BLM, Audubon's VP of Public Lands, actually is now the interim BLM lead at this time. So we are engaging on that front, and we do see the ACR program as a tool to facilitate and incentivize better management of public lands.
Marshall, I have a question about, well, thanks for sharing your goals for the next couple of years. Can you talk a little bit more about expansion into other states or regions? Will you be enrolling ranchers or farmers in the upper Midwest, like more east of where you currently work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to back this slide up here to the map and just visually show this to you. So over the course of the next year, we are looking to add roughly 700,000 to 1,000,000 acres in this region. So with the driftless region of Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, and on into Michigan as well. So this is sort of the target of our growth in the next year. And we have a number of interested market partners that will help us facilitate that growth into the upper Midwest. It's certainly it's a different landscape. I will say our costs per ranch are sort of fixed, whether it's a 300-acre ranch or 300,000-acre ranch. Our costs are sort of fixed, and in that landscape, a 1,000-acre ranch is a huge ranch, right? It's that size of a ranch in Wisconsin is just ginormous. Whereas that's sort of a small ranch and probably unprofitable ranch in central North Dakota and in Wyoming. So we want to be really thoughtful about expanding into the upper Midwest, knowing that landscape is going to look a lot different. You're starting to get to sort of the eastern range of, I use the historic bison as a marker. You're starting to get into the sort of eastern far range of the bison historical territory, and we will run up against certain questions. Should we certify a clear cut for a landscape that may have been a bottomland forest or a floodplain forest, but it was cleared for pasture land 100 years ago or 20 years ago? Those questions will abound in outside of those core areas like the driftless region, other tall grass prairie regions in that part of the country. But we are committed to expanding into that part of the world for the benefit of Henslow sparrows, prairie chickens, and other birds that really need that range for their life cycle.
Well, that is excellent to hear. I am curious, is there a specific staff contact that we in the Upper Midwest should be in touch with about that expansion?
Yes, and I'm going to drop Daniel Suarez, his information below.
Thank you.
Don't tell him that I'm the reason his inbox is.
And while you're doing that, Marshall, I think I'll just wrap us up because we're at time here. But just want to say a huge thank you to Marshall for speaking today. That was a great presentation and sounds like there'll be some follow-ups. And thank you all for coming. And we hope to see you on the platform and at future calls.